Welcome to the Curry Corbett Sunday School class. We are in our third week, also the third chapter of Daniel. And we're trying to find from the book of Daniel life experiences that we can apply to today's living. Our lesson today is on living courageously. I wouldn't say it's easier to live in the United States. It's difficult to live anywhere. But we don't have the consequences for our courage sometimes living in this country that many people do. It's something to consider as we go through this lesson. What is the hottest place that you've ever been? I remember at our high school we had a boiler room. And as I recall, they burned coal in there. One of the hottest places I've ever been was in that room. I've been to the Death Valley out west, and many of you have, and daily temperatures reach 120 degrees. That is hot. I don't care if they say it is dry. That is hot. Cooking over a hot stove can be very hot. In most any attic that you go in the summer is going to be very hot. Those of you who played high school football can recall the first preschool practices in August. That is very hot. I've never done this, but it just looks like when you see scenes of people who work in a steel mill, that looks like a very hot place to work. Many of us have experienced parking your car out in a big parking lot August, first part of September, and it's been closed up to the sun, and you step in there. Those are very, very hot places. Today we're going to look at three men who were threatened by a blazing hot furnace. And when you think of getting in a hot car, you think about going into a hot attic, you don't really understand what it would be to be, that's hot enough, but to think about stepping inside of a blazing hot furnace. Their determination to obey God was tested, as we will see. But they remained courageously firm in their commitment to God despite the threat. Very, very courageous. And we will see we have to be ready and willing to stand up for God in this way. So there are clash of commitments. We talked about last week, or a couple of weeks ago, on this subject, and how difficult it is to be committed, to have ground to stand on, that you say, I'm not compromising, I'm committed to this. It is a conviction. Just a little background here. We've heard the names of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. That's the Hebrew names of the three young men who were taken into exile along with Daniel into Babylonian. After they had been there in some period of time while they were in training in Babylon, they were given Babylonian names. Those Babylonian names were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We will see in chapter 3 that they have received those Babylonian names. They're no longer referred to in their Hebrew names. And we will see that in chapter 3 here. Just a little more background. Last week we saw where Nebuchadnezzar had his dreams interpreted by Daniel. After that happened, Nebuchadnezzar was not necessarily full of himself, but he had to be somewhat to do what he did. He built this huge statue of gold, and he set it up in the province of Babylon. And then he summoned all the high officials, all the governors, all the people with any office, and even citizens who were well-to-do, well thought of, and had political influence of some kind. He invited all those people to come and help dedicate the image. Then we pick up in Daniel 3, verse 4. Then the king loudly proclaimed, nations and persons of every language, this is what you're commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold, Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. So here the picture you see. They hear music and all but 3 men fall down. These are the young men who were brought captive to Babylonia. These are the ones from the kingdom of Judah along with Daniel. But Daniel is not here. So when the people kneel, you can see that they stick out like a sore thumb. You can only think that the people right around kneeling, they're peeping and they're looking and thinking, what are these guys thinking? They know that they're going to be thrown into a blazing furnace. But they stood firm. Part of their raising, part of their culture, part of their belief, what they stand fast on is that they will worship no other God. But listen for the second chance that King Nebuchadnezzar gives them. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold that I have set up? After all, I'm the king, right? I did this, and I'm the highest. I am the God, and you fail to worship me. Now, when you hear the sound of music, all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" So he's giving them a second chance. He's telling them again, maybe you didn't understand. Listen, when you hear the sound of music, and there will be all kinds of music, fall down, worship my God, worship the image that I made. If I throw you in that furnace, what God is going to save you? Why do you think the king gave them a second chance? He certainly didn't offer that to anyone else. Listen, he liked these men, as we've seen in the first 2 chapters of Daniel. They only brought the brightest from the kingdom of Judah up to Babylonia. And they brought them there to train them in the Babylonian ways, to teach their culture. They intended to use them to help sway other people, help educate other people in the Babylonian way. He liked them. He had called them the best among the best. They were very good administrators. Truth is, he really didn't want to lose them. He had invested at least 3 years of training, and probably had been on the job some period of time here, so he had a lot of it invested in them. They had experienced, and he was pleased with them. What arrogance about Jehovah do you see here in the scripture above, as if to say, no God can save you? There's nothing, according to his thinking anyway, that can save anyone from that furnace except Nebuchadnezzar himself. At any point along the way, they could have changed their minds. They could have, we used that word that we used last week, they could have assimilated. They could have changed their way of thinking to fit the culture that they were in, but they did not. They were willing to stand for God and face the consequences. But they could have played it safe, keep out of trouble, go along with the crowd, just this one time. It won't be upsetting. All I've got to do is just kneel down along with these hundreds of other people, stand up, keep thinking what I think and believing what I believe. Would have been easy to do. When we're pressured to conform, to go along with the crowd, that's a lot of pressure. To go along with an illegal or immoral business practice, and we see this all of the time. You see people in big companies that are wanting to do the best they can. They want the promotions, and always in some environment like that, you have people that are willing to go beyond what is even gray, and it puts a lot of pressure on everyone around them. conform to politically correct speech. There's a narrative always being created. And sometimes that narrative is not what you may feel like is spiritually correct. And you hear people talking in the break rooms and in the different environments, and people conforming to the speech that's being talked about, to the narrative, conforming to that. Or join in on a group of bullying someone. To tolerate something that is obviously against God's teaching. How will we recognize these situations when to take a stand? One of the big things that will help us is to know ahead of time what God's standards are. Convictions. Having good, strong convictions, which we've covered. But knowing ahead of time what God's standards are is through studying these and developing those high standards. Realizing ahead of time we will be confronted with the world. The world is coming to you. The world has already come to you many, many times. It's been hammered on you. Assimilate, change, new world, new ways of doing things. Realize ahead of time Satan is at work, and you're going to be confronted with him. Make the decision now to be faithful with God. Have those standards and be true to your convictions. Have ground that you're willing to stand on and not change. And be ready to state your opinion with the right kind of attitude. You don't have to be combative, just stating your opinions tactfully. So there's going to be a clash of commitments. Your commitments may not always coincide with the commitments of others, but we must have an immovable faith. Listen for how sure the three men are. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter." Very brave, very courageous statement there. If we are thrown into a blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. You know, the king must have been chuckling a little bit when these three young men said that we don't need to defend ourselves. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is going to save us. Now, he must have been chuckling. He said, you know, as bright as I thought these guys were, they are very naive. How did the three respond to the king? We do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us. They are willing to stand in the fire and believe and have faith that God will be able to save them. Now, we have stood in many hot places, maybe something not as hot as to truly threaten our lives immediately, but we have been there. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your hand. He will rescue us from evil. Even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods. We will not bend our standards to buy us time or save us. For even if we die, we know that God will take care of us. What were the three young men unsure of? They were unsure that God could rescue them. They were unsure if God would rescue them. They will not presume on God or tell him what to do. Again, the outcome may not have been what the three wanted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But they knew that whatever outcome came, they would be in God's hand. What is the connection between courage and faith? This is one of those Sunday school questions that would make a very good discussion and hear different perspectives on this question. What is the connection between courage and faith? You must be totally convinced of God's power and authority. We cannot be weak or have doubt around this statement. You must be totally convinced of God's power and authority. When you have that sure conviction, you can have the courage to face whatever comes along. When you believe it, you can live it. When you believe it, you can live it. The issue is not strength of your faith. The issue is the strength of the object of your faith. And the object of your faith is Almighty God. How is there and our faith related to obedience? How is our faith related to obedience? Another good discussion question. Trusting God will be demonstrated how? Trusting God will be demonstrated by what we do, our actions. They believed that God could save them, so they did the right thing and they refused to bow down. That must have been a lonely feeling, to be standing and looking around and hundreds, perhaps thousands of people bowing and conforming, and there you stand. But they did the right thing. They refused to bow down. Remember James 2 verse 17. In the same way, faith by itself is not accompanied by action, is dead. They acted, and they certainly were going against the flow to do so. So finally, we have these clash of commitments. Not everyone's committed to the same things, but we must establish an immovable faith and be willing to hold on to that faith with all of your life. Listen for evidence of a true miracle. So in Daniel 3 verses 26 and 27, Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace, and he shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out. Come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. And all of the people there, all of the highest ranking officials in all of the land, from all of the regions, were there, and they all crowded around them. Can you imagine? These three guys standing in the hot furnace. In spite of it, nothing happened when they were in there. He asked them to come out. In Daniel 3 verse 28, they saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair on their head singed. Their robes were not scorched. There was no smell of fire on them. And Nebuchadnezzar said, listen to this. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own. You know, I wonder if he really understood. Was he viewing the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as some image? Was he viewing him as some spirit that lived on a hill or a region, or exactly what his view was of God, the Holy God, the creator of everything, the power of everything? Wonder what his view was. He had certainly just witnessed a very powerful thing. What did the crowd observe when the men came out of the fire? Well, they saw that the fire had not harmed them in any kind of way. Their clothes were still intact, their hair, everything that should have burned should have disappeared. How did the king respond to the king's deliverance of these three men? He said, Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He did not say, Praise to the God. the one, the only God. Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But it was a start, I suppose. They trusted him. They defied the king's command. They were willing to give their lives to serve the God that they believe in. There's the lesson for us, that we have to stand firm when we're in the fire. We have to believe. We have to trust. We have to be willing to give up our lives rather than conform to which way the wind is blowing. If we know that is not right, we know that it's not what we studied, what we believe. It doesn't always, appear to work out. It doesn't always work out this way. Here's some examples of Christian courage that did not have a happy outcome. You remember Stephen? Stephen didn't deserve it, but Stephen was stoned to death. Many, many, many Christians died in Roman persecution. Christianity was not something that the Romans embraced. In fact, in many ways, Christianity threatened how the Romans wanted to rule. And many, many Christians died in that persecution, but people stood fast. Even today, believers suffer and die for standing up for their faith. Not every country today wants to tolerate Christianity. And people suffer daily because of it. Many people lose their life, in fact. What should our response be to these kind of events? We have to realize that God is sovereign. He is all power. He is all everything. And he has a plan. We have to believe that. In faith, we have to believe that. Death is actually one form of deliverance. Death is one form. God could have taken them in that fire, and they could have been delivered from Nebuchadnezzar. They could have been delivered from all that they would have to go through in the future. And sometimes we are delivered that way, sometimes not. It's his plan. We should pray for those who face persecution in foreign lands. They need prayers of encouragement to give them courage. We need to pray for their testimony and their strength to deliver their testimony. And we must pray for peace in the midst of all this great suffering. And this last one is hard to do, but we are taught to do this as Christians. We must pray for those who persecute them, and we must pray for those who persecute us. So how do we apply today's lesson? Live courageously. We must pray for others who are taking a stand. There's so many missionary families, and we support 2 missionary families in our church. We need to be always praying for them, praying persistently for them, for their provision, for their strength. And we must be prepared. The world is coming to you. Tomorrow, this week, Satan is out there and he is working. We must decide every day what we will do, how we will use our faith, because it will most certainly be challenged. And we need the courage. Be courageous to speak up. Look for opportunities to proclaim his name. Remember the attitudes of the 3 men in our story. They stated their position tactfully, carefully. They declared their faith calmly and with assurance. God give us the courage to do the same. Thank you for being with us. Next week we will take chapter 4. It will be the 4th week of Daniel. Read chapter 4, and we will take the things that were happening in that chapter and apply it to our daily living. Have a wonderful week.